The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
1-year-old guy with white hair to talk about these modern, newfangled problems. But anyway, I find myself doing it from time to time. One of the initial steps in the risk management process is to figure out what your problems are, what your exposures are. And in traditional insurance areas, we've gotten fairly good at that when we're talking about property and liability and automobiles and equipment and machinery and that kind of thing. But the internet has opened up an entirely new world to all of us. And all of us are struggling in some ways to get our hands around the kinds of exposures that the internet creates. I did a talk up at Appalachian while I was there in the fall of 16 to a large group of students in the business college, and I told them, I said, you know, the problem we've got is the internet was really created by some research beetles in Europe and the US. Some scientists, some technical people who wanted to share information and research and talk to one another, transfer messages to one another. And we've taken that fairly simple system and exploded it into a global platform for commerce. And the problem is that when the system was designed, they didn't design any security into the system. They didn't design any traceability into the system. And now, when this thing is just a monstrous platform, we're trying to figure out what our exposures are, the vulnerabilities are, and engineer solutions on the fly when the thing's up and running. And that is not only a daunting process for us in the insurance business, I'm sure it's a daunting process for the IT professionals, because these exposures seem to pop up faster than we can figure out what they are and where they come from. So the big thing is understanding vulnerabilities, and the new part about this from the insurance world is that we have spent most of our time talking about tangible property and tangible bodily injury type things, and now we're having to focus on intangible property, information, and electronic access and that kind of thing. And so it's a real problem for us and for the industry to try to take forms that were not really designed for this type of these types of exposures and try to re-engineer them to begin to work. And so we can talk about that a little bit later. So the big thing, first of all, is beginning to understand your vulnerabilities. And there are a number of things out there. I mean, most businesses today have electronic data of some kind, whether it's their data or whether it's somebody else's data. They have data, and sometimes that data can be used illicitly or fraudulently to cause harm to the people about whom the data is. And there are a number of laws that are getting on the books now, both at the state and federal level, that are imposing fines and penalties and other sorts of sanctions on businesses that have possession of other people's information, and that information is breached and used to harm the people whose information it is. So data breach has been one of the big things we've been talking about for the last few years, but there are a whole nother area of exposures that are arising in the internet. I mean, viruses have been around for a long time. Malware of various sorts have been around for a long time. We've dealt with denial of service type events for a while now, but we're seeing various types of extortion coming on now, where data may be compromised in some way, and there's a threat to use it in a fraudulent or illicit way, and they want money to avoid doing that. And one specific example of that is ransomware, where people are able to get into your system, able to begin encrypting data, and they are the only ones that know how to unencrypt that data. and they then want they want money to restore your data. And we've seen that not only in large businesses and hospitals and things like that, but a number of small businesses. And the problem is, unless you can forensically cleanse that the pathways into your system, then this could be the kind of thing we had in the organized crime back in the 30s. This was, you had to just pay us every month kind of thing. So and some of the ransomware people are smart enough to, the money they want is less than the cost of remediation, and so people just pay it and really don't solve the problem. And that's a real sort of scary scenario. Interruption of business activities, which is largely denial of services, has been around, and it's a big problem. And then the reputational risk. If you have other people's information, they are trusting you to be responsible with that information, and if it turns out that you're not, they may be reluctant to let you have credit card numbers or social security numbers or whatever the driver's license numbers or mother's maiden names or whatever information can be used in some kind of illicit fashion. So, and we've seen this with some of the real notorious type cases, the Targets and some of those Equifax and some of those kinds of events that have taken place. The amount of money they're having to spend on crisis management and advertising to try to maintain their reputation is just, they're just huge amounts of money involved with that. Next slide, Eric. Eric, can you switch the slide for me?
Oh, sorry, Stuart. I had myself on mute. So we had real quick, I wanted to kind of get you to hit on kind of the future, specifically around legal recourse like GDPR. It's not just an embarrassment any longer, right? So our state's Attorney General, Josh Stein, just recently introduced legislation here in North Carolina to strengthen theft protection, ID theft protection for North Carolina residents by expanding the definition of personal information, classing ransomware as a breach, and requiring faster notification times. So it's not just, you know, a reputational thing anymore when it's moving kind of more towards a legal exposure, right?
Yeah, well, and there are several different legal exposures. One, certainly from the regulatory standpoint, the fines and penalties and sanctions, those types of things, but also the damage that can result to your customers if their credit is impaired or damaged in some way. You can be held legally responsible for that, and that's where some of the expenses like monitoring, credit monitoring, and those kinds of things can come into play. So, I mean, the law is emerging as these issues emerge, and we're not really, you know, I don't think we don't know exactly the extent to which we might be exposed for some of these cyber or internet type events.
And I think from a data breach insurance coverage perspective, that's kind of what's on most people's minds, right? Being able to insure some risk around if they do have an exposure, some of those things that you're required to do.
Yeah, but now there are some businesses that may not have a lot of customer data. They may have more proprietary information, plans, designs, patents, whatever. That material could be subject to being surreptitiously acquired also. So that's why I say that understanding your vulnerabilities is really important, and it may take a professional like Eric and some of his team to sit down with you and really think through what your exposures to the cyber world may be, because without that step being done, you're going to be very confused when the insurance guys start talking about stuff, and some of it may be beneficial to you and some of it may not be beneficial to you. It just depends on what your exposures are. So it makes you a much more efficient buyer of these internet or cyber type coverages if you know that what you're buying will address more specifically what your vulnerabilities are.
Yeah, good point.
And we talked about intangible property, but one of the things that's really emerging now is some old-fashioned type crimes that are being done in a new and technological way. And so money is being stolen through the internet. Property is being stolen through the internet, and we haven't even got to really understanding the Internet of Things yet, where you have all these connected devices, and someone can gain unauthorized access to these devices and possibly do either property damage or bodily injury or Lord knows what. If it's a drone and they take it over and bring down an aircraft, I mean, those kinds of things are just kind of really spooky. On the money side, I was reading an article this morning actually, that some hackers have figured out how to get into the Mexican banking system and have basically transferred over $15 million out of the Mexican banking system to other banks, which was then withdrawn and disappeared. And the article said, and I have no factual information about this one way or the other, but the article said that there have been hacks to the SWIFT system, which is what our banks use, our domestic banks use. And if that is true, if someone knows how to get into the SWIFT system, then they know how those transactions take place. And then you have the question of, could someone intercept a funds transfer and reroute it to a different place? And I have anecdotal information that that's happened in a couple of situations. I don't know what the technology of that is, but it's been reported to me from some sources that there have been a couple of occurrences of that. Fraudulent impersonation is a big thing today. This is a theft of money. Well, fraudulent impersonation is the insurance euphemism for someone sending an email to your CFO or to your accountant, whoever writes your checks, and the email appears to be coming from you or your some person in responsibility, and they're authorizing the transfer of monies. And the person transfers the money only to find out that the email did not come from the person it purported to come from, and the money's gone. And I do know of numerous situations where this has occurred, and we are beginning to see some insurance coverages, some old-fashioned coverages, come into play to pick up some of this exposure. And the Bitcoins and cryptocurrencies, virtual money is a big thing today. If it's virtual and apparently I bought a Bitcoin a few years ago, lost a couple $100 and sold it. So I'm not kind of in the Bitcoin business anymore. But it's been a hot topic in the last few months because of the value of these things have gone through the roof. And the value is virtual. I mean, it's not a currency in the sense that you can pick it up and hand it to someone in exchange for goods and services. And if the value is solely virtual, then anybody that can, and someone was trying to explain blockchain stuff to me the other day and how hard it would be to manipulate this stuff, but I don't get it. If it's virtual, it seems to me that there's a potential for this stuff to be manipulated. Some of the crime insurance forms that have been around for a long time that have dealt with money have had exclusions show up for virtual money because it's not traditional currency. And there are some endorsements now if you're dealing with virtual money and you want that to be pulled back into your crime forms, there's some endorsements available that will do that. Computer fraud is a term that's been around in the insurance world for a long time, and that was where people send you bogus invoices or in some way get into your system and have you transfer property, not necessarily money, but property to an illicit destination. And that's been around, and I don't know, don't have any personal information about anything about that recently, but I know that's been talked about for some time. And I've been to a couple of meetings where this Internet of Things is being talked about a great deal. And we're talking about now driverless cars, even though there was another accident the other day where I think a Tesla vehicle rear-ended a fire truck because when it was on automatic pilot. And so once all these cars and airplanes and all this equipment gets connected, anyone that can intercede into that data link basically can control the equipment. And so I don't know how we will figure out to protect ourselves against that, but we've already seen a couple of years ago a situation where someone was able to take a cell phone and cut off a Jeep Cherokee with it because your cars have internet connections now and links, data links. And so if someone can get in through that data link, then they can basically control your car. So this is just an exploding area of concern because we're becoming interconnected faster than we can keep up with what some of the implications for that are. And so I think that's going to be a real frontier in risk management, is trying to figure out what vulnerabilities these systems have and what we can do about it. Next slide. Once you figure out what your exposures are, you really sort of have to evaluate those exposures in terms of what are the more severe exposures and what are the less severe exposures. And obviously you want to do things about the most severe exposures or more severe exposures first. And some of the things we can do in risk management is we can avoid things. We can not have losses occur because we don't do certain things anymore. Now, in the internet world and the cyber world, a lot of access to private networks is gained through carelessness or lack of training of employees in their opening emails or their opening going into websites, and that they don't understand what the implications are, and malware or controlling software is being transferred into their systems. And so a lot of exposures, some of these exposures can be avoided through training, making sure your employees understand what the dangers are and what to do when you get unsolicited emails or emails from sources you don't know where they are coming from, and those kinds of things. So a degree of caution it can go a long ways in trying to avoid some of these things. There are situations though where you just can't avoid the issues, and so we look for ways to control the exposure so that we can mitigate it to some degree. Now, in insurance terminology, we talk about frequency and severity. The frequency is how often something bad could happen. The severity is how expensive is it going to be when it happens. And so we're constantly looking at ways that we can control severity and frequency. Controlling access to your networks, I don't know much about what the IT people do with your switches and all the things that they can do to control access to your system, but everything that you can do to tie down your systems so that only the access to those systems that is appropriate is obviously very, very important to do. Monitoring any kind of suspicious activity. I was on a panel a year and a half ago with some IT people for some of the businesses in the research area, and they were talking about, we had a lot of conversation about ransomware and how quickly that could occur, and it was almost they were monitoring stuff on a minute-to-minute basis to see if there all of a sudden something very unexpected change took place, and they would be able to shut systems down and stop backups and do all kinds of things, because if this ransomware gets in there and starts encrypting your data, and then you start backing up the encrypted data, then you're just compounding the problem. Regular backups are obviously very important, and then managed IT services. I know Eric's sponsoring this, and I don't want his head to get too big, but But the importance of IT professionals today in this process cannot be overemphasized, because most of us hardly. There was a time when I understood a little bit about networks and could do some things with them, although I was technically trained with them. But the complexity of these things has gotten to the point today that without IT professionals, you really are just sort of flying blind. And so having IT professionals that are looking at your system or monitoring your system and doing the kind of routine things that need to be done to keep the patches up in your servers and all those kinds of things, it's just absolutely mandatory these days to avoid the risk of some defective piece of software being taken advantage of by some hacker.
And so I'll tell you, Stuart, from our perspective, the number one thing we see is user actions. So it used to be good enough to protect devices with antivirus software and keep them patched, and yeah, you certainly still have to do that. But the criminals out there, they see the opportunity, and they've become increasingly sophisticated. They can buy the same tools we use, and they test their approaches against these tools before they throw them out there in the wild. And you're starting to see kind of this proliferation of antivirus software and anti-malware software and software, just focused on blocking ransomware, because of these hackers getting increasingly sophisticated. But it almost always starts with a user clicking on something, or a user getting an email and not checking it close enough, and transferring money to the wrong place, and those type of things. And those things, like you said, are hard to guard against without oodles of training.
Yeah, and it happened to me when I went up to Appalachian. I got a different printer for my laptop, and I was trying to update the driver for that printer, and somehow got onto a website, and the next thing I know, my keyboard wouldn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to basically wipe the system, and I lost everything and had to rebuild it to get rid of that malware. And I was in a hurry. I was trying to get something done without the requisite diligence, and I got myself in trouble. Now I don't think they got any data, but they basically shut down my ability to use my laptop, and I needed it pretty badly. So I've seen that myself. That scary. I think these people ought to be hung personally, but
yeah, if you could just find them, right?
Yeah, just find them. Now, once you've avoided what you can avoid, and once you've done everything you can do to reduce or control the exposures, you're still going to have some residual issues left over. There's just going to be some things that you can't avoid, or you can't prevent or control. And then that's where really the backup position is: how do we pay for these things when they happen? And of course, insurance is, you can pay for it out of your pocket if you want to, but insurance is one of the ways to sort of buy this protection for a few cents on the dollar. And so there's been a lot there's been a lot of conversation about cyber policies. The word cyber is a little bit on the dangerous side, because a lot of data breach policies are being called cyber policies. And the implication there is that if I buy a cyber policy, then I'm covered for whatever gets me from the internet. But a data breach policy is only about data breach. It's not about ransomware. It's not about fraudulent impersonation. It's not about electronic funds transfer. It's not about the traditional kinds of property damage. And that's why it's so important to understand what your vulnerabilities are, so that, because there are, I read recently that there are 120 insurance companies, it's estimated there are 120 insurance companies writing some type of cyber coverage today. And they're all there, and there is a standard form, but nobody uses it. Everybody's using their own forms. And so in theory, there's 120 different policy forms out there. They all use different language. They're all arranged different. I have actually tried to compare some of these forms, and it is a daunting, almost impossible process to make any kind of reasonable comparison, because of the different formats and the different terminology. We do not have any standardized language now to talk about these things with from the insurance perspective. One of the things I want you to understand, though, about when you start looking at the kind of damage that can occur, and what we do about it is we generally in the insurance business break damage into two categories: direct damage, which would be damage to your software, the theft of data, a ransomware type situation where you've locked up your system and you can't use it anymore. Those would be examples of direct damage.
And just real quick, Stuart, I want to interrupt you for just a second because I want everybody to kind of sit up and pay attention here, because this is the meat of it, right? And this is why we have Stuart, because we get so many questions about customers who have completed these applications, to your point, that are so many of them and everyone's different, and we have to complete some of it without really understanding what their risks are or what that coverage would cover, right? So this is it, right? This is the important stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and the second category is what we call indirect losses, which are consequences of the direct losses. So a denial of service, the direct loss is that your computer is not working. The indirect loss is there's a lot of sales that are not being made. And so those are, in some cases, those can be larger. The indirect losses, the interruption to your business operations, can be a larger exposure than the actual direct damage itself. And then the third category, which is really not a property damage or a damage category, which is the legal side, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But traditionally in insurance forms, we have had property forms, and those property forms could be written to cover direct damage, which would be your building burning down or blowing away. They could be written to cover indirect damage, which is the interruption of your business because your building burned down or blew away. And we have general liability forms that cover lawsuits arising out of damage to other people caused by your operations, and they're separate policy forms. And so what we're seeing now in these cyber forms is a palette or a buffet of different coverages which you can pick and choose. And some of the coverages have the term liability in the title and some of them don't. And if it has liability in the title, then that's a coverage form that's going to protect you if what you do damages some third party and they bring a suit against you for the harm that's been incurred, that they've incurred. If liability is not in the title, then that's something that's going to pay you. We insurance geeks like myself generally talk about insurance policies in terms of calling them first-party policies or third-party policies. A third-party policy is basically a policy where you pay the premium to the insurance company, and if something goes wrong, the insurance company pays somebody else. That's your general liability, your automobile liability, those kinds of coverages. A first-party policy is where you pay the premiums. If something goes wrong, the insurance company pays you. And so for a lot of the exposures having to do with the cost of notification, if there's a data breach, the forensics having to figure out how they got in and how to stop it, the crisis management, the credit monitoring, all those kinds of things, the interruption of business operations, all those kinds of things are generally first-party coverages where the insurance company is going to settle up with you. But you have to be careful looking at these forms because they mix all these things together, and if you're not really paying attention, you can get really confused about exactly what the coverage is designed to do. Next slide. And so some of the things that are coming up today that fall within cyber crimes, which are not covered by the data breach policies, we've mentioned the diversion of electronic funds transfer. I was actually, one of the jobs I had when I worked for the Big I Association was we had an agency there that purchased all the insurance for the state of North Carolina. And as you can imagine, there were some pretty big numbers involved with this, and we did a program for the universities for health insurance for students, and there was some huge dollars involved with that. And so we had literally millions of dollars that were coming into us electronically, and we were turning around and electronically sending that money to insurance companies. And I decided that it'd be smart if I looked at our coverage to see what we were covered for, and come to find out in reading the forms that some types of electronic funds transfers are covered by insurance. We didn't have near enough for some of those transfers, sometimes some types of transfers are not. And so this is a potentially an area where if someone calls up the bank and impersonating you and authorizes a funds transfer, and the bank sends the money and it disappears, that traditionally has been insurable up to whatever the policy limits are. The problem I was concerned about is this diversion of a transfer where the bank pushes the button and sends the money, but the money doesn't get to the place it was supposed to get to. It gets diverted somewhere. And that was not covered by our insurance. And when I looked at the bank electronic funds transfer agreements, the banks disclaimed any responsibility for the money once they pushed the button. And so that was a real problem for us because we could not cover if one of those multi-million-dollar transfers didn't get to where it was supposed to get to. We did not have the funds to pay that again. Now, we used a very sophisticated risk management technique to deal with that. We got the state agencies to send the money directly to the insurance company and bypass us, which didn't solve the problem. It just got us out of the risk. But that's something that's because you think of the money that's being zipped around the world every day in these funds transfers. And if someone figures out how to identify those things and reroute them, it's going to be a serious problem. We've already talked about fraudulent impersonation and the problem with that. Diversion of products is really the kind of computer fraud. Ransomware is, and we've talked about cyber vandalism, which has been around for a long time, which is basically just getting in and hacking up your system and making it unusable or destroying some of your information or limiting the functionality of your computer. Those things have been around for a while, and we have decent protection against those things. But again, if you're opening up things you shouldn't be opening up, or if you're going to websites you shouldn't be going to, then you may be opening pathways to cyber vandals that they can wreak havoc on your system. And then we've also talked about cryptocurrencies and the fact that those are not generally excluded from standard insurance policies that cover money. And if you've got an exposure for those things, it needs to be something you talk to your insurance agent about and try to get that coverage bought back into your crime forms. Next slide.
Hey, Stuart, I've got a question here. Actually, it's on the last slide, and it is the talk about the differences between a breach, what constitutes a breach. So I think that a lot of people are under the impression that anything that, like a virus gets in and, wipes out your data, would that trigger, an incident based on the definition of a breach?
I don't think so. It depends on the policy form, but my sense is that would not be a breach because nothing. If you think of data breach as if somebody broke into your office and stole your customers' files, paper files, and they had access to information that they could use illicitly, that would be what we're talking about in a data breach is the electronic equivalent of that. Now, a lot of these data breach forms cover data, not just electronic data, but any kind of data, paper data. So if you still have paper records, and under certain data breach forms, if you still had paper records and somebody broke in and stole your paper records, then the misuse of that information would be covered under the breach form. So it's really the stealing either physically or electronically of information that they're not supposed to have, and the potential to use that information to the harm or detriment of someone, either yourself or other people.
So what happens when, say, the state of North Carolina passes this enhanced bill and classifies ransomware as a breach? And as soon as they do that, obviously from a state standpoint, they can mandate you let people know or provide coverage against this, blah blah blah. But then does that just automatically translate into the insurance form itself and what constitutes a breach? I mean, do they follow what the state dictates, or how does that work?
No, it's a private contract, and it would not necessarily conform to what the state law says. And what I don't understand about that, and this is more of a political issue than it is a technical issue, I think, if ransomware gets into my system and locks it up, how am I going to get access to my customers to notify them?
Right. Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think it's a buzzword, and the politicians love to come up with simple solutions to complex problems, but this may be creating a trap that is just almost impossible to comply with. And so I would have some concerns about associating ransomware with data breach, because they're entirely different things. Data breach, your information may still be there. They didn't destroy your information; they just stole copies of it, and so you've got your customer information, and you know who to notify. But if your data has been locked up so you can't get to it, then I don't know how you're going to notify anybody.
Yeah, I agree. So here's a question for you: is talk about loss of revenue in coverage under data breach coverage. So if somebody steals your data or encrypts it, and you can't operate as a business for a couple of days. I'm assuming there's some provision in there to help with that, right?
There in some of the forms they have a business income form. Now, the problem is going to be valuing what your loss is. And I'm not saying the insurance company is going to send you a bunch of blank checks, but if you can substantiate that your profits would have been higher if this cyber event had not taken place, or if you've got increased expenses associated with continuing to operate in an impaired or a partially impaired situation, then yeah, there are forms that will address that exposure.
Got it. So a question has come in. Another question says, how do we train and remind users avoidance habits in dealing with fraudulent emails? So that's great question. I've written a couple of blog posts on this, on how to identify those type of things, and then also as we see new ones, we kind of add that to our database of things for users to be aware of. But I can tell you, kind of going forward, the user training piece is going to be its own cottage industry, if you will. And we're looking at a couple of different programs here at TA for our customers to be able to do continual training and continual probing and testing against these users, because it's a lot easier for us to find out if somebody's fallen for something than for a cyber criminal to find out that they're falling for something, right?
I can tell you the insurance, if you in the fraudulent impersonation endorsements that I've seen, which is pretty much an industry standard form, one of the conditions is what's called verification. Now there are some different versions of verification, but to simplify it, if you get an email from the president of the company that says transfer $100,000 to China, you call up, you email the president or pick up the phone and say, you really want me to do this?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's a very simple thing to do. You're just not going to send $100,000 because you got the email. And so that's a training issue also. Be suspicious of emails asking you to do things that you haven't been asked to do before, and particularly if they want money sent to some place you've never sent money before. That should be something that you confirm before you do.
So, and it's even more sophisticated than that. I got a call from not a customer of ours, but a business in Greensboro, and they routinely buy tractor trailers from another manufacturer there in Greensboro. And what had happened is either their email system or the manufacturer's email system had been hacked, and they the criminals were watching these transactions go across, and they caught that, hey, look, these people are buying a trailer. Right at the last minute, they sent an email either from the manufacturers or from the purchasers, says, hey, look, hey, everything's good to go. You can come pick this thing up today. Oh, by the way, we have a new bank account number. Here it is.
Right.
And so this is something that the buyer was expecting to pay, coming from what looked like their manufacturer who they'd done business with in the past. The scary thing, like I told the business, look, that's not a random thing, man. They were in either your system or your manufacturer's system, and unless you figured that out and closed that door, they're probably still there.
Yeah, I got introduced to some lawyers who do a lot of real estate transactions and some other types of transactions where they have trust accounts. They're sending money in and out all the time, and they had found out that somebody had gotten hold of their employees' email addresses and were sending out emails to people that appeared to be coming from a legitimate person. So it wasn't the president's email one character off. This was appeared to be an email from a person they had dealt with before, and so I mean it's hard to stay ahead of this stuff.
But I think your point is some common sense, and I ran into that, so I stashed a little money away for retirement, and normally I do it via email. Email my financial planner, hey, look, draft this money, and he calls me on the phone, hey, did you just send that email? I said, yeah, why? He says, we have to verbally verify every transaction now.
I think that only makes sense. I mean, if in fact it is a fraudulent instruction that appears to be from you, but from a legitimate person, but it's really not, then that should be verified. And I mean, email is probably, I can remember 30, 40 years ago writing business letters and taking an hour to sit down and write a business letter. And we don't do stuff like that anymore. We type stuff off and hit the button and we're done in a matter of seconds, and it's not a particularly reliable system, and it's really a poor substitute for formal business communication. I mean, you can encrypt these emails, but my understanding of the problem with encryption, and you can correct me about this because I certainly don't profess to have a lot of technical skill in this stuff, is that the person on the other end's got to have the key in order to unencrypt the thing. And so
yeah, but I think it was just yesterday where PGP MIME was hacked. So this is kind of the gold standard of email encryption that just went down like 2 days ago. So even that is not even good enough. So
well, I mean, we have gotten to a level of convenience that's almost dangerous in some of this, and we've just got to step back and say, if we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, there needs to be a clear and unequivocal understanding that this is what somebody wants done, not just an email that purports to be from somebody. And so we've got to just change our culture a little bit on this stuff. We've gotten far too loose and far too blasé about this stuff, and it's starting to hurt.
Yeah. So number one thing that people should take away from this is, making sure that any of those transactions, any of those transfers that are more than just a couple of bucks, they need to be verified. You need to take just a couple more minutes, save yourself a lot of headache, and ensure that. And I think customers in general will not only respect that but appreciate it.
Yeah, because it looks like due diligence on a transaction, and rather than just the first thing that pops onto your screen. And so I just think I'm an old-timey guy, and I'm not really comfortable with some of this technology, and maybe that's a good thing. I spent a year with a bunch of millennials that think nothing can go wrong from technology, and I'm waiting for them to get in the real world and hit the buzzsaw, because they're so comfortable with these technologies that they just don't see the potential harm.
Right. So here's a question that came in. Insuring, so what do you do? What is the exposure, and how do you insure against third-party risks? And I think the example here, where they're getting is like, so often we see businesses feel like moving stuff to the cloud is the end-all, be-all of security, and this, I think we're learning that that's not the case. But in the case of, say, like Allscripts, it recently had ransomware, and had tens of thousands of medical practices that could not access their data. Where do these small businesses that rely on these cloud services have any way to cover those type of risks?
Well, let's dissect that exposure a little bit. I mean, number one, you've moved your data off-site and you've put it in the custody of someone else. Now, you can get someone else to basically guarantee, or there are legal agreements called indemnity agreements or hold harmless agreements that basically say if they screw up and the data gets breached and you get sued as a result of that, then they'll take care of it. But the problem with risk transfers, contractual risk transfers of that nature, is you transferring something to someone that doesn't have the capacity to pay up doesn't really do you any good. And so, in a lot of cases, if you read these, these software documents, when you lease a piece of software and there's this 9-page document you're supposed to read and accept.
You don't read all those?
Oh no, and I'm just gonna crawl under a rock if anything goes wrong. But I'm sure there are insidious provisions in those things absolving those people of any responsibility for a lot of things. And so we're now technically, and I'm not a lawyer, I play one on television from time to time, but I'm not a lawyer and I don't want to be giving legal advice, but technically, generally you have to do something wrong. You have to have some control over the circumstances, or you have to have some foreseeability in order to have negligence and in order to have legal liability. So if it's something that you had no control over, couldn't see, couldn't imagine, it's kind of hard, other than a statute imposing liability on you, and that's what some of these identity fraud statutes and privacy statutes are beginning to do. It's kind of like workers' comp. Your employees get hurt and it's no fault of yours, you still pay, and that's because the workers' comp law says you have to. It's not a fault-based system. It's an absolute responsibility to pay for employee injuries, and so under a tort legal situation, there's got to be some allegation that you did something wrong or failed to do something right in order for you to have a civil liability for that. But if a statute comes along and says if the data gets breached and you didn't do sufficient things to protect it, then you're going to be held legally liable by statute. That's a whole nother order of magnitude. And so there are liability coverages in some of these cyber policies, but largely they have to do with data breach. And for some of these other areas now, I was trying to think of another way, other liabilities that could arise, but well, it's my understanding, and you can correct me again because I don't understand the technology of a lot of this stuff, that the way these denial of services attacks take place is they go out and they distribute these little cyber bombs on all these different systems, and they're timed to go off at a certain point in time, and all of a sudden all these systems start accessing this one website, and it crashes the site. Well, I mean, if the business whose site got crashed found out where some of those inputs were coming from, and could I be legally liable for the fact that someone got into my system and used it as a platform to attack that website? I don't know. That's a legal question. I'm not a lawyer, but there are some liability coverages in these forms. But let me emphasize the fact that the insurance industry has no particularly clear insight into where this stuff's going. And we're just all poking around in the dark trying to figure out what these things are and how to take care of them. And so as these things emerge, and the problem the insurance industry has is we are an industry whose pricing is typically based on past loss experience. And we're being asked to cover things now that there's no past loss experience on. And so figuring out how to price this stuff is a pretty scary thing. And there are a lot of companies now who are writing this stuff, and there are voices in our industry that are saying there are too many people writing too much stuff that they don't really understand what the potential is. And when insurance companies start getting losses that they didn't anticipate, they start becoming financially unstable. And so that's a concern, that there's a lot of money flowing into this, and we don't necessarily have, from an actuarial perspective, have a good handle on what our real future cost of these things might be.
Yep, good point.
So just to sum up, every dollar spent on training, prevention, and control of cyber vulnerabilities is thousands of dollars saved from losses. And cyber insurance is a backstop when training and prevention and control fail. It's not, you don't want to have a loss. The insurance company can come up with some money, and the insurance company can help. I mean, a lot of these cyber policies have packaged services in the event of a loss, for a notification, for crisis control. They've already lined up the specialists to do this stuff, and that's a great thing. So it's a call an 800 number, and all of a sudden they take care of all these different problems. That's great, but the time, the aggravation, the wear and tear on your staff, the damage to your customers, there's no monetizing some of those things, and there's no way to make you whole for some of those things. So you don't want to have a loss, and so the money you spend to avoid losses is probably the best investment you can make in this financially in this area, because it saves you from not only direct losses, but also just a myriad of indirect losses, time, emotion, time away from your business. It can be quite daunting, the complexity of working yourself out of some of these situations after they occur.
Yeah. So one last question here, and I think it's a darn good one. Just kind of summarize maybe the top one or two things a business should consider, keep in mind when they're evaluating data breach or cybersecurity coverage.
Well, that's not a 2-minute question. I think, again, you know what your vulnerabilities are, and then whoever is helping you with the insurance coverage, address those vulnerabilities and make sure that the coverages that they are offering you deal with those vulnerabilities. And if they don't deal with them, you need to know that too. Because if you buy something that doesn't cover what your problem is, you've still got a problem. And so it's a real problem, because we're all struggling to understand these very, very complex and often emerging exposures. And it takes a while for the industry to figure out if an exposure is something that they can insure. But you need to be asking the question. You need to know what you need, and you need to ask the people in the insurance world, does this policy cover my needs? And here are my 4 needs, and how does this policy address those 4 things? And it'll make you a much more effective and efficient purchaser of these coverages, and you'll have less surprises down the road.
Outstanding. All right. So any other questions? Nope, I think I've got them all. All right. So, again, Stuart, thank you so much. You've been a friend for a really long time, and I appreciate your input on this and bringing your expertise here for us. If anybody does have any questions, Stuart's nice enough to give us his email here, so you can certainly shoot him over and ask him. So once again, Stuart, thank you very much. And to everybody, we'll see you next month.
Certainly.